So for the last part, I'm very glad to and honored to introduce Rima Nasrallah. She's assistant professor of practical theology at the Nearest School of Theology in Beirut. She holds an MA Master of Arts in Living Reformed Theology, as well as a Master of Philosophy with a focus on ethnography and theology, both from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. She holds a PhD in Liturgical-Ritual studies from the Protestant Theological University Amsterdam. Her academic interests include contemporary Eastern Christian studies, as well as the study of Christianity in Late Modernity. Her focus is the empirical study of lived theology and the practices of faith in the everyday life. She gives special attention to gender, context, performance, and the arts. Nasrallah van Saane teaches courses in pastoral theology, worship, on liturgy, preaching, and Eastern Christianity. So thank you, Rima, for your coming contribution. You represent also the female voice in those 2 days, and it's quite important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we focus now a little bit more on one aspect of ACO's mission work and another period of time, which is the second half of the 20th century. Of the roughly 42 ACO units sent to Lebanon and Syria during the 20th century, 20 of them came as single female missionaries, single women. And at least 10 additional women were known to work alongside their husbands. We know that women constituted the majority in Protestant mission movements worldwide, and much has been written about women missionaries, missionary work in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. However, very little is written about this still rich period of the second half of the 20th century, particularly in our region. What were some of the changes during this period of time? What role did gender play in the lives of these women? And what form did this female agency and leadership take? These are some of the questions that I asked myself when I was looking at some of the material that I found. I could read some of the memoirs, interviews, and testimonies of the women who actually came to Lebanon and Syria. And here I would like to thank Elizabeth Muchner for all the work that she had done in summarizing and scanning papers from the archives in Strasbourg for the sake of this research. And I could also take a look at some of the testimonies of local Protestants who got in touch with the missionaries themselves. So here I try to sketch some patterns and trends that I noticed during this eventful period of time. But I also recognize that these women were still trying to cope with and contest old patterns that they had inherited. At the end of this paper, I also mentioned the case of the Center for Practical and Spiritual Formation of Young Girls in Zahli, which in my opinion illustrates the end of an era in this gendered form of mission work. It is not only in Lebanon and Syria, and not only among ACO missionaries, that this period was a transitional period. The rapid socio-political change in the region, coupled with theological shifts, as well as administrative restructuring of mission engines in the West, meant that particularly between 1958 and 1970, things started to look different on the ground. This was especially visible for American Presbyterian missions, with whom ACO personnel cooperated quite closely, and with whom they shared tasks with joint local partners such as the Synod and the NEST. It was also a time of transition for the now 100 years old local Protestant churches who had seen their people become two peoples divided over two most of the time antagonistic and separate countries, Syria and Lebanon, and who have also started the complicated task of taking over responsibility and the administrative burden from the dwindling and departing American leadership. In what concerns ACO female missionaries, we start seeing during this period some slow transitions in their position and their relationship to the field. One of the first things we notice is a gradual move. And here I'm trying to shift my screen. For some reason, it doesn't want to. Okay. Transition from career missionaries to limited term appointments. At the beginning of the 1950s, many not so young single women were sent from Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands to spend the rest of their career in Lebanon and Syria. This was a long-term personal investment. These women had to master the local languages, for some of them, both Arabic and Armenian, and embrace the local culture. In addition, they were required to do some Bible schooling. Their ministry was often not fixed, but changed with time as the circumstances changed. They also moved location in response to political and security issues. And they had to keep learning new skills to meet the changing need. Swiss missionary Helen Hartmann and Alice Ulmer both started their journey in Aleppo. After being expelled out of Syria, Hartmann came to Beirut, then Hasbaya, then Sarbin, and finally ended up in Zahli. Ulmer moved to Beirut, then Anjar, and then back to Normaraj. And Dutch Nans Groeneveld moved to Sarbin, to Zahli, to Beit Shama, and finally to Hammana. These career missionary women often found themselves doing everything, and often tasks they were not trained for. Teaching in schools, leading Bible studies, doing pastoral work, nursing the sick, but also overseeing building projects, managing institutions, negotiating with authorities, as well as leading relief campaigns. Alice Ulmer says, "J'étais la bonne à tout faire." And Nans Groeneveld expressed the same position. "Soms was ik manusje van alles." However, by the end of the 70s, as these career missionaries were starting to retire and return to Europe, we start witnessing the advent of the limited term workers, which became the norm in the 90s, and for whom language mastery was not required, and clear tasks with partnership agreements were rather fixed, at least on paper. Women were sent to work as nurses in Hamlin, for example, or as teachers in a school. Another change that marks this period is a change of identification or designation. During this time, the general devolution of many mission apparatuses in the Middle East, the term missionary became less and less used. For these ACO women, the agreements with the Armenian Union starting 1955 and developing later in 1962 and in 1964, both for the Union and the Synod, meant that these women who were sent as missionaries will henceforth be known as ouvrières fraternelles, fraternal workers. This is by no means only a change of name, but also of position. From then on, they were not sent to, but were working with and under local leadership. For example, Ulmer explains, l'Église évangélique arménienne m'a donc engagée à Beirut. Nuns worked under the direction of Dr. Nucho and the supervision of the pastors of the Synod. A third transition during this period, particularly to the women workers, is a shift away from the term endearment, Mairig, mum or mama, to a more professional and formal title, Miss. At the beginning of the 20th century, many missionaries working particularly with the Armenians before, during, and after the genocide were known and addressed as Mairig or Mama. Naturally, in the case of the Armenians, who had become individually, but also as a nation, orphaned, the loving care and utmost dedication and sacrifice shown by these women had procured them this title. This was most obvious with legendary Hedwig Bull. Bull worked with the Armenians prior to the genocide and then dedicated her life to help restructuring theirs upon their arrival to Syria. With her extraordinary energy, she established numerous schools, built 2 sewing factories, and relocated an entire neighborhood, building new houses and securing running water. This mothering role and feeling expresses itself as an attachment to a people, a nation, rather than to a task. After her return home, she anxiously sought out someone who would, and I quote here, who would take care of the Armenians. However, it is not only among Armenians that we encounter this mothering role of female missionaries. For some Arabs and non-Arabs, indefatigable Alsatian Anne-Marie Beck-Tartar was also referred to as Mum. Working in Aleppo and Hasaki from 1940 till 1976, her open-door policy of encouragement towards young people in particular earned her the Mum title. Nevertheless, in the second half of the 20th century, we slowly see this role disappear, and new female missionaries become known as Miss, and even refer to themselves, as we see on the cover of Miss Nunn's book, as Miss. The attachment and the dedication were more directed towards the task entrusted to them and the institution they served, such as Hamlin or Church of Christ, or even the church they are attached to, rather than the nation in general or the peoples. Coping and contesting of patterns. Despite these changes and transitions, we also see some enduring patterns that were more difficult to change. Up until the end of the 20th century, most of the women sent by ACO were still typically single women, though this was largely the case in American missions earlier that century. After World War I, the American women's mission movement began to lose its momentum, and many of the separate women's associations were merged with the broader missionary movement, thus losing their specific gender-based identity. Within the ACO context, gender and female celibacy kept being a determining factor for quite a long time, impacting women's work and the work with women. These women benefited from some of the freedom their celibate status gave them, and shared among each other a feeling of sisterhood and solidarity. Celibacy, historian Dana Robert puts it, bestowed upon these women a gender neutrality that allowed them to overcome some of the normal expectations of and limitations on women in traditional societies, or as missionary Hattie de Jong experienced it, a masculine society. The village of Sarbin around the year 60 was a hub for single female ACO missionaries. Helen Hartman arrived first. She had been recently kicked out of Syria. Knowing the prejudice that surrounded women living alone in this area, Mademoiselle Beatrix Hullevel from Grandchamp community came to be with her. Nans Groeneveld was with them since 1956, followed shortly by Katrine Groeneboom, and then by Sir Yvonne Fabre from the Saint-Loup community. It was very natural for these women to cooperate with the remaining single female American missionaries, as well as with the Hillsbond sisters, as they shared the same partners, the Synod and the Armenian Union. Later, when she was in the Hamlin Hospital, nuns worked closely with other missionaries like Marion Carter and Australian Cheryl Smith, and found in them soul sisters. Beside the Swiss deaconesses from Longchamp and Saint-Loup, there was also a sense of kinship and cooperation with local Maronite nuns. Nuns, says, they asked that I pray for them, and I have promised to pray, and they have promised to pray for me. And finally, all these ACO missionaries developed long-lasting partnerships and friendships with local single collaborators, the autochtones. Alice Ulmer teamed up with Saruhi Pashajukshian, and Hartman with Samira Da'bous, and nuns with Amal Ishaq. Though they were known by others as Miss or Mademoiselle, they referred to each other as sister, including any woman, Westerner or local, who was involved in the ministry. The sisterhood was very important for personal encouragement, but also to shield themselves from the suspicious society who, as Hattie de Jong explained, kept asking, why aren't you married? While Hattie and Saida Groen had only each other in the 90s and could support each other, Corina de Groot, who came in 1998, had no sister and had to resort to wearing a wedding band to shield herself. Besides these single women, there was in the service of ACO a number of missionary wives. These wives were less visible and less connected than the single missionaries. Until 1997, they were mostly unnamed and their task was largely undefined. It is only after 1997 that we start reading about Willem and Emma, Frederic and Laurence, and Bernard and Helene, even if still the roles of these wives remained vague. Female leadership and agency. Looking at the lists of men and women sent to Lebanon during the second part of the century, we are struck that the list included 15 men who were sent as professors to work at the NAST. The women were sent to do traditional women's work. They were supposed to work with women, with children, and in nursing. These missionary women were aware that there were restrictions and expectations based on their gender. Some of these restrictions came from the local government or the culture. For example, we know that the woman couldn't officially represent the mission in Syria, and therefore, in the absence of an ACO man, Mr. Lytle from an Irish mission had to do the job. When she arrived to Lebanon, Hartman was escorted by men, local pastors, as well as male American missionaries who were trying to find a place for her. She was also aware that a single woman cannot live in an apartment alone. As she launched her ambitious project for young women, the board supervising the work was made up of 4 men, and it depended on the visits of the male evangelists and pastors, both American and Lebanese. Though Hartman had shared with the local Zahle pastor, Reverend Howley at the time, that back in Switzerland she had preached in churches, he clearly told her that, and I quote, "It is out of the question that you preach in our churches," end of quote. Some of the restrictions came from the mission itself. We know from Hartman that the regulations for women in the 80s were different than those for men. For example, women were required to retire at the age of 62, while men at the age of 65. Restrictions on marriage in the field and the involvement of the mission leaders in these decisions are also speaking. Though 3 of these single female missionaries, Anne-Marie Beck Tartar, Lenny Ferhar Gantous, and Hilda Saunders Bakalyan, ended up marrying local men, we know from the case of Madame Tartar that such marriages were not encouraged. She herself struggled with Paul Béron and the ACO committee, and her feelings were questioned as they considered him, and I quote again, much older and Syrian and not educated, unquote. She, on the other hand, writes back ready to leave the ACO and expressing her rights as a woman to choose her husband. Reading their reports and hearing the testimony of locals who got in touch with them, we discovered that though these women were expected to occupy feminine tasks and positions, in practice, as the example of Madame Tartar displays, they each had her way of enlarging these tasks and negotiating the roles. Madame Tartar was initially teaching French and started a school in Hasaki. She developed and expanded this role, not only to include weekly Bible studies for women, hospital visits, missionary expeditions, and relief work, but to cause an outright revival in the Church of Christ, transforming the Miss Bull compound into a beehive of spiritual and social activities. Our expectation would be that these women made the most influence on young women. However, reports from those who got in touch with her show that many young men's lives were transformed because of the strong but calm woman and her authentic and passionate spirituality. She coached and trained the youth and sent them on mission trips. And she was a fixture in the church and took her place among the pastors. Many of the women did indeed fill the pastoral role of preaching, teaching, and caring, albeit in creative ways and only outside formal church contexts. Nuns was what we could call today a chaplain in the Hamelin Hospital, an elderly home. Hattie de Jong, after her, did the same and considered herself a pastor to the people she ministered to. Hartman led services in the small villages, 12 of them, surrounding Sarbin, where there were only 2 or 3 evangelical families left in each, and where no pastor was visiting anymore. We know only of one woman who was sent as a pastor to Lebanon, Madame Monod, but we don't know really what she was doing. Maybe one day we should visit the archives and discover. Not only their manner of leadership was contested territory, but we also see a bit of confusion on what to do for young girls. Though educating women was one of the greatest legacies of Protestant mission work in its early phase, and home economics is its development and innovation in the 1920s, it seemed a bit surprising to encounter a similar project in the 1980s. The idea to do something for the young women of the Bekaa came out of a genuine observation by Hartman and her companions that girls in rural areas are getting less educated than boys, and they seem to be spending their teenage years waiting for a husband. On the 16th of October 1965, Hartman could inaugurate her big project with the National Evangelical Synod, a center for the spiritual and practical formation of girls in the village of Sarbin. In the center, the ACO missionary ladies, aided by some locals, offered classes in Arabic, French, childcare, and knitting. They aimed to teach the girls to become independent and to solve practical, intellectual, and spiritual problems, even if personal spiritual life seemed to be difficult to learn. Though work among young women in general was quite successful in Sarbin, it seems that recruiting girls to join the center was challenging. The local committee then insists to move the center to the more accessible town of Zahle in 1971. Yet still, the number of boarding girls did not seem to increase. Naturally, the escalating political tension during the Lebanese Civil War was a great hindrance. But as work on a new building and expansion continues, the number of girls served only decreased. Hartman explained that she sometimes had 8, 6, 4, or 3 girls in total. In addition, most of these girls were recruited from Syria and not from Lebanon. Eventually, this whole project aborts in the year 1981, and the building, which was repeatedly damaged, gets converted into a conference center. The example of the Center of Formation for Young Girls is an indication that some of the old patterns of ministering to women by focusing on domesticity and on the boarding concept were not suitable anymore. Reading the memoirs of these women and hearing their names being praised to this day from Hasaki to Zahle and from Aleppo to Beirut, one can only admire their tenacity and resilience. They have ministered in Lebanon and Syria during extremely difficult and changing times. They experienced hostility from local authority, lived through wars and danger, and had to keep negotiating their roles as women in the East while trying to understand what the locals needed, particularly the women among them. And as they battled through it all, they have impacted the lives of those they encountered in ways they hadn't planned and expected, and maintained long-lasting relationships. Thank you.
Thank you.